This is a video presentation of Bible 2114, Bible Survey, Unit number 12, entitled Conquest and Judges. As a result of this lecture and the reading of pages 204 through 225 of the text Erdman's Handbook to the Bible and the books of Joshua and Judges in the Bible, the student should be able to evaluate the influence of Joshua in the history of the conquest, indicate the underlying themes of the books of Joshua and Judges, compare the approach of the book of Joshua with the book of Judges, identify the judges and evaluate their activity, and place the relative position of each of the tribes on a map. Your speaker today is Dr. Roy Hayden. The conquest of the land, ultimately settled by Israel, actually began under Moses. The area to the east of the Jordan River had been conquered, and 2 1/2 tribes had settled there. The area is especially good for the grazing of cattle and sheep. Here is the area referred to as Gilead and Bashan. Later, the prophet Amos will liken the pampered women of Israel to the fat and sleek cows of Bashan. Moses had died soon after he had been allowed to view the land from Mount Nebo. The Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev and the plain, that is, the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. Joshua was then commissioned to lead the people across the Jordan River into the land promised by Yahweh. He ordered that the people be ready to cross in 3 days. He also spoke to the 2 1/2 tribes, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Remember the command that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you. The land your God is giving you rest and has granted you this land. Your wives, your children, and your livestock may stay in the land that Moses gave you east of the Jordan, but all your fighting men, fully armed, must cross over ahead of your brothers. Only after all the Israelites had occupied the lands would they be allowed to return to their homes on the east of Jordan. Spies were sent secretly to Jericho. They were discovered, but a woman by the name of Rahab hid them under stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof of her home. She told the king's men that the spies had been there, but that they had left at dusk. After the search party had left, she made a deal with the spies. She agreed that she would not disclose their business if they would agree to spare her and her family when they captured the city of Jericho. To this the spies agreed. She then let them down through a window outside the city wall, for her house was part of the city wall itself. Since I may not think to mention it later, if you will check the genealogy in Matthew 1, you will find in verse 5 that Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. And in verse 3, Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Thus we have Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth, all foreigners, who are prominent in the bloodline of Jesus. The actual crossing of the Jordan River is described in detail. The water was blocked at Adam, near Zarethan, about 18 miles north of Jericho. The Israelites were thus able to easily cross on dry ground. This view shows Tel Ed Damiah, identified as the city of Adam. Potsherds found on the Tel show that the site was occupied in the period of Joshua. Large stones from the bed of the Jordan River were set up as a memorial in the camp at Gilgal. There were 12 stones, one for each of the tribes. Joshua said to the Israelites, "In the future, when your descendants ask their fathers, 'What do these stones mean?' tell them, 'Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan just what he had done to the Sea of Reeds when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, that you might always fear the Lord your God." It is important that you observe the purpose of these miracles. There is always a purpose behind them. They are never performed just as a show. The crossing of the Jordan served to encourage the Israelites because they saw the power of their God. At the same time, it caused panic in the hearts of Israel's enemies for the same reason. In the camp at Gilgal, another important event took place. The sign of the covenant God made with Abraham was the rite of circumcision. Every male was supposed to have been circumcised at the age of 8 days. And Joshua 5:5 says that the Israelites born in the desert during the journey from Egypt had not been circumcised. Knives of flint, such as those pictured here, were made, and the rite was carried out. The next step was the capture of Jericho. The present Old Testament mound of Tel Es Sultan does not seem very impressive by 20th century standards. We are used to sprawling cities which stretch for miles. An average city in those days was only a few acres. Jericho was 12 acres. Jericho was the earliest fortified city in the world and is the oldest continuously inhabited city. This tower is dated to before 7000 BC. The mound has an accumulation of over 70 feet of debris from previous occupations. Joshua took the city of Jericho by a strange tactic of walking around the city once each day for 6 days, and 7 times the 7th day. At the blast of the trumpets and the shouts of the people, the city walls collapsed, and the city fell to the Israelites. Rahab was spared. Achan, one of the Israelite soldiers, took some loot from the ruined city, contrary to the command of God, and he was severely punished. His sin was discovered when the Israelites attacked Ai and were defeated. By lot, it was determined that Achan was responsible for the defeat. He admitted his guilt and was sentenced to die. The silver, the robe, the gold wedge, all of which he had stolen, his sons and daughters, his cattle, donkeys and sheep, his tent, and all that he had were taken to the valley of Achor. There he and his family were stoned and burned, and a large pile of stones were placed over them. This story is very important because of the emphasis it places on communal responsibility. The sin of one man affected the whole nation, and his sin also brought about the death of his entire family. The city of Ai was then taken, this time by means of an ambush. Then, without any break in the text at all, an altar was built on Mount Ebal. On the map, notice that Shechem, which is beside Mount Ebal, is in the heart of the country. Abraham stopped at Shechem on his way into Canaan, and Jacob bought property there, which was later given to Joseph as his inheritance. No battle has been fought, nor is there any record of any battle taking place in this region. The Israelites merely moved in. Here at Shechem had been discovered an ancient holy place. Abraham had built an altar there. The city is situated on the border of the territories of Ephraim and Manasseh. They are the 2 sons of Joseph. It appears as if they merely walked in and settled, perhaps even being welcomed by the local population. Before his death, Joshua set up a stone, plastered it, and copied on it the law. The bones of Joseph were also buried near Shechem. This is the traditional tomb of Joseph. Not far away is the traditional well of Jacob, which he dug, and by which Jesus sat and talked to the Samaritan woman. Chapter 9 of Joshua resumes the story of the conquest. Kings from the hill country, the Shephelah, and the plains assembled to fight Israel. Gibeon and 3 other cities, however, decided to make peace with Israel. By a ruse, they pretended that they had come from a great distance. Actually, they were only a few miles away. Joshua 9:14 states, "The men of Israel sampled their provisions, but did not consult the Lord. Joshua made a treaty with them, and then discovered to his dismay that he had been tricked. Nevertheless, because they had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, they honored the treaty." Several kings from the surrounding region learned of the treaty that Gibeon and its neighbors had made with Israel, and they formed a coalition to fight against them. Included in the coalition were the kings of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. Word was sent to Joshua that Gibeon was being attacked. After an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took the coalition by surprise and defeated them. Israel pursued them down the Beth-horon road, shown here, all the way to Azekah and Makkedah. Not only did Joshua kill many of the enemy, but God hurled large hailstones down on them from the sky, and more of them died from the hailstones than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. On this occasion was the famous long day. Joshua said, "O sun, stand still over Gibeon, O moon, over the valley of Ayalon." So the sun stopped, and the moon stood still, till the nation took vengeance on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jashar. This one battle gave Joshua effective control of all the southern part of the land. Not all the enemies were defeated, but any unified resistance was gone. The book of Judges makes it clear that there were many pockets of resistance left, and it was not until the time of David that the whole area of the Promised Land came under the absolute control of Israel. The campaign in the north also is described as a single battle. This is found in chapter 11. Another coalition was formed with Jabin, king of Hatzor, as leader. These kings united, encamped at the waters of Merom. Joshua came against them suddenly at the waters of Merom and attacked them, and the Lord handed them over to Israel. They defeated them and pursued them all the way to Greater Sidon, to Mishrophoth-Maim, and to the valley of Mizpah on the east, until they left no one alive. Joshua 11, verses 7 and 8. Joshua took the city of Hatzor and burned it. This was significant, for the usual practice was to settle their own people in the captured cities. Joshua 11:13 expresses this. Yet Israel did not burn any of the cities built on their mounds, except Hatzor, which Joshua burned. A summary of all that Joshua did and all the land he captured is given in chapter 11, verses 15 through 19. As the Lord commanded his servant Moses, so Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did it. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses. Verse 18 may give a hint that the wars were of much longer duration than just 2 single campaigns. For it says, Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. Chapter 12 is a summary of the kings conquered by Joshua. Chapter 13:1 again indicates that much was still to be done. Most of the rest of the book of Joshua is concerned with delineating the territory assigned to each tribe. The map on page 215 of the text gives the relative positions of each tribe. The soldiers from the 2 1/2 tribes were allowed to return home after the rest of the land had been secured. A civil war almost broke out when they erected an altar near the Jordan at Gilalot. They were accused of apostasy, but when they explained it was merely a memorial of the unity of the tribes, the Israelites were glad to hear the report and praised God. And they said no more about going to war against them to devastate the country where they lived. Sometime later, Joshua again assembled all Israel at Shechem. He reviewed their history and then challenged them to serve only Yahweh, the God of Israel. The people said to Joshua, "We will serve the Lord our God and obey him." The covenant was renewed. A large stone was set up to be a witness to the covenant. The pictured is a large stone from Shechem. The book of Judges serves 2 functions. It helps to give a corrective understanding of the conquest by showing that it was far more complicated and lengthy than the impression we get from the book of Joshua. And theologically, it gives emphasis to the 4-fold cycle of sin, punishment, repentance, and restoration, which it illustrates time and time again. The first chapter gives some idea of the process used by the tribes in attempting to dislodge the inhabitants of Canaan. In chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, the reason is given why the Israelites have not been successful in their venture, and it also gives the basis for the interpretation of the whole book of Judges. The angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you out of Egypt and led you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall not make a covenant with the people of this land, but you shall destroy their altars. Yet you have disobeyed me. Why have you done this? Now therefore I tell you that I will not drive them out before you. They will trap you, and their gods will snare you. The rest of chapter 2 says that after Joshua and his generation died, the next generation did what was evil in God's sight. The Lord was angry with them, so he handed them over to raiders who plundered them and sold them to enemies all around. Then God would provide judges or deliverers for the people who would rescue them from their enemies. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, served and worshipped other gods. 12 judges are listed on page 220 of the textbook. Some of these have elaborate stories told about their exploits. Others have only a sentence, or at most a paragraph. From the map, also on page 220, you will note that the judges mentioned fairly well cover the land geographically. All that we know about Cushan-Rishathaim is that he oppressed Israel 8 years, and then was overpowered by Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. Othniel was mentioned earlier in both Joshua and Judges concerning the capture of Kiryat Sefer. Caleb had promised that he would give his daughter Akshah in marriage to the one who attacked and took Kiryat Sefer. Othniel took it. Ehud was a left-handed or ambidextrous person who made himself a double-edged sword about 12 inches long. His exploit consisted in planting this sword in the belly of Eglon, king of Moab. In the confusion that followed, the Israelites were summoned. The fords of the Jordan were taken, and about 10,000 Moabites were killed. Then the land had peace for 80 years. Note the multiples of 40 that appear. Othniel's action brought 40 years of peace. Ehud brought 80. Judges chapters 4 and 5 describe the battle of part of the Israelites with Jabin's general by the name of Sisera. Deborah, a prophetess, sat under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came to her to decide their disputes. She summoned a man from Naphtali named Barak, and told him that God had commanded that he take 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun and lead the way to Mount Tabor. God would then give Jabin's army into their hands. Barak was reluctant to go unless Deborah went with him. She agreed, but warned him that the credit for the victory over Sisera would go to a woman. According to the poetic version in chapter 5, the chariots of Sisera were rendered inoperable by the waters of the Kishon River. This river, shown in the picture, flows through the Jezreel Valley alongside Mount Carmel. In the rainy season, the waters of the river rise, and in a particularly wet year, they rush along in a turbulent current that sweeps away everything in its path. The flood may have taken Sisera by surprise. Deborah saw in this a miracle. From the heavens the stars fought, from their courses they fought against Sisera. The river Kishon swept them away, the aged-old river, the river Kishon. Sisera fled to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. There he was done in by a tent peg through his skull. The poetic section says it best. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. She struck Sisera, she crushed his head, she shattered and pierced his temple. At her feet he sank, he fell. There he lay. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. Gideon was called by an angel of the Lord to free the people from the harassment of the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples who would cross over the Jordan to the valley of Jezreel during the harvest time and take the grain. The first act of Gideon, with the help of 10 of his servants, was to tear down the altar to Baal which belonged to his father, and to cut down the pole sacred to Asherah. He built a new altar to Yahweh, and with the wood from the pole, he sacrificed his father's bull as a burnt offering. When the townspeople saw what had been done, they demanded that Gideon die. His father, however, suggested that if Baal really was a god, he could defend himself when someone tore down his altar. Later, Gideon led a picked force of 300 men against the Midianites and their allies. The army started with 32,000 men. They were encamped by the spring of Harod, shown in this scene. Those who were afraid were sent home. That left 10,000, still too many. All were taken down to the water to drink. Those who drank in a certain way, the text is difficult to interpret at this point, were chosen. This left 300. By using pitchers with torches inside and trumpets, Gideon threw the camp of the enemy into confusion, and they began fighting among themselves. Those who were able to flee fled. Word went out to the Israelites to block the fords of the Jordan in order that they could cut off the escape of the Midianites. Much else followed, but the points of interest in this story center in the interrelationship of God and Gideon. Gideon had to be convinced that God really had called him. This was accomplished by a reverse miracle, the fleece. Then God wanted Gideon to know that it was not his skill or any other ability that he might have that would win the victory. Breaking pottery, horns, and torches are not the usual equipment for fighting battles. The account of Abimelech, the son of Gideon, is a sordid tale which ends in tragedy for both Abimelech and the people of Shechem, who had originally helped him in his conspiracy. Jephthah is a tragic figure. Born of Gilead and a prostitute, Jephthah was ostracized by his father's legitimate children. But when a military leader was needed, he was the only qualified person available. Jephthah led a force against the Ammonites and soundly defeated them. However, before the battle, he rashly promised that if the Lord would give him the victory, he would sacrifice as a burnt offering whoever came out of the door of his house. His only child, a daughter, was the first to greet him. From the text, it seems that he carried out his vow and sacrificed his daughter. In addition to this tragedy, Jephthah also was engaged in a war with Ephraim. Previously, Gideon had had trouble with that tribe, but through smooth talking, he was able to avoid trouble. But Jephthah was not so fortunate. 42,000 Ephraimites were killed at the fords of the Jordan when they were asked to pronounce Shibboleth, and they said Sibboleth. This points to a dialectical difference in the language at that time. Samson is known to every student, either through the Bible or through the numerous movies made about him. There are many interesting details in the story, but time does not permit me to expound on them or to even try to correct all the misrepresentations in movies in Sunday school literature. Samson was unique. His service to the Israelites was the harassment of the Philistines. Despite Samson's moral code, or lack of it, God still used him. Just recently at a site in Tel Aviv called Tel Kasila were found the remains of a Philistine temple, the only temple found so far. In this picture we see the plan of the temple. Entrance was from the upper right. A full 90-degree turn to the right brought the worshiper into the holy place. Note the dot in the middle of the picture and the other small circle immediately to the left. These were pillars which held up the roof of the building. It is interesting that in the only Philistine temple known, the structure bears out the biblical text. In Judges 16, verses 29 and 30, Then Samson reached toward the two central pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. The last story in the book is another sordid account of degenerate behavior, this among the Benjamites. The purpose of this story may be to put the tribe of Benjamin in a bad light. It ties in closely with the closing words of the book, which is a theme found frequently in the book itself. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Saul was Israel's first king, and he was from Benjamin. He was less than desirable. David was the ideal king. Perhaps 2 points are to be made. Israel needed a king, but a king like Saul was not the answer. In this lecture, we have indicated how Joshua led the people across the Jordan, took Jericho, and then in 2 major campaigns subdued the land. Judges, however, points out that the actual occupation was a long and difficult task, not really accomplished until the time of David. The 4-fold cycle of sin, punishment, repentance, and restoration is a major theme of the book of Judges. The judges were deliverers raised up by God at crucial times to help his people.
This has been a video presentation of Bible Survey, Unit Number 12, entitled Conquest and Judges. This program has been produced by the Department of Educational Media of Oral Roberts University.